I want to welcome you back for part 2 of our podcast called Law Matters with our wonderful guest, Mr. Ronald Brise, a former legislator and former chair of the Public Service Commission and now a member of the Gunston firm. And previously we talked about how laws were passed. Now we want to talk about specific laws and what impact they may have on us and help us understand it so we can make better use of it and be better society, be better members of our society. Again, Brise, I want to thank you and welcome back. I'm going to just jump right into it. One of the laws that we've been hearing a lot about is the voting law that's taken into effect. Some may call it a suppression law. Others may call it protection of our voting rights. Tell us a little bit of that law that's come into place that the governor recently signed.
Sure. Thank you. And that's a very important piece of legislation that passed this last legislative session. And I think the governor signed it today, as a matter of fact. So SB 90, right, which is the House, is the Senate number, and in the House it's House Bill 7041. And so in the Senate it was called Election Administration by Senator Baxley, and in the House it was Election Public Integrity and Elections Committee by Byrd and Ingoglia. So let's talk about how we got here. And I think that's probably important to lay that predicate. If you recall, in 2000, we had a debacle with respect to the elections process here in the state of Florida.
That was the election of
President Bush.
And he was running against Al Gore.
Al Gore.
And we all remember the Chads in your area, South Florida.
Yeah, the hanging Chads in Palm Beach County.
Right.
Palm Beach County, 586 vote difference and so forth.
Yeah, we can't forget that.
We can't forget. But since that time, the state of Florida has been consistently improving the election process.
Yeah.
To the point that Florida was, as far as the last election went, the gold standard in elections. You look across the country, one can argue whatever you want. Our process here worked very well.
Yes.
And so therefore,
no more hanging Chads.
No more hanging Chads. So we have vote by mail.
Yes.
Right? That works well. We have early voting. That works well. We have our process so that there is efficiency in the counting of ballots. And so, therefore, there has been a good partnership between our supervisors of elections across the state and legislators, so that you can build policy so that it makes sense. Then we had this last election, and certain people didn't appreciate the outcome of the national election.
Right.
And there has been a movement afoot across the country. 43 states essentially have new legislation that would change the voting laws to what some would say make it more challenging for people to vote.
Some would say that.
Right.
Others would say what?
Others would say that they're strengthening the voting process so that it would keep out any fraud in the process.
Yeah.
The reality is that when people have done audits of elections over the past decades and even the last elections, the fraud percentage is under 1%, right?
Now, just to be clear, where are you gathering this information from? You've talked about audits. Where are these audits taking place?
Sure. So what ends up happening, you have public integrity institutions, right? Whether they're universities and others who have done these type of audits, and they do them regularly. And they find that, yes, every election has fraud in it, right?
Wow.
Every election has fraud.
That may be breaking news for some.
Right.
Every election
has fraud. So there's always someone who shouldn't vote that ends up voting, right? But generally, they're caught. And so therefore, and it's usually under 1%, and so therefore there is no impact on the outcome of the election.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question that you already answered. Yes, there may be fraud in every election, but you're saying based upon the audits, the impact of that fraud is not just minuscule, but it's negated because would have no effect on the election of swaying it either yay or nay, or red or blue or independent, whatever your vote was going to be. The amount of fraud that was detected was minimal.
Right, de minimis.
De minimis.
So you may have, for example, it was in the news the other day that there was a man who voted for his dead mom, right?
He voted on behalf of his dead
on behalf of his dead mom. So he
soul.
voted himself, and then he also voted on behalf of his dead mom. So that was found in one of these audits, right? So when you think about what needs to happen, right, to make policy, you generally look at what are the problems that actually need to be addressed. And so rather than the legislature spending time to look at how do we decrease lines, how do we make sure that people have greater access to registering to vote and making the process more efficient for people, what they've done was to take some of the things that made it easier to vote for folk and made it a little bit more challenging. I'll give you a couple examples. Right now in Florida, if you're a vote by mail voter, you don't have to register for vote by mail until a general election. So that means every 4 years. So now, if you want to register, if you want to be a vote by mail voter, you have to do it every election.
And when you say every election, we're talking about for the general and for the midterms.
General and midterms.
And does that also that includes the general election for the president? That includes the midterm for your federal legislature. What about for the state? The state races, like for governor? What impact does it have on that race?
So those were generally set on the state general elections. So now every 2 years you have to make sure that you are on the rolls for vote by mail.
So if I wanted to vote by mail, I have to register at every 2 years to make sure I can vote by mail.
Right.
When previously I could do it once every 4 years.
4 years.
All right.
Correct.
Now you indicated that makes it more difficult to vote. You believe so?
Yeah, it makes it more onerous.
Onerous, yes.
Right? So it's another hoop that people have to go through in order to do that. Then there's the other issue of signatures, right?
Yes.
There's a signature match component. So there has been question or concern about that. So that is something that the bill addresses, that you now have your signature has to match. Now,
well, isn't that just common sense though? You don't want your signature not to match, then.
Right. But when you think about it, if you've registered to vote when you're 17 years old and you're 40 years old, chances are that your signature is not going to directly match. And so therefore, that becomes an issue, right? Then you have this issue of the drop boxes,
yes.
For example. I know that has been a big issue that people have been talking about. So during the last election, the supervisors of election throughout the state, because of the pandemic and because of the record turnout that was happening, they said, you know what, we're going to put drop boxes out and people can just put their vote by mail or their ballots in there when it's convenient for them. Well, this law says that supervisors of election can only put drop boxes to accept ballots during the hours of early voting, which essentially defeats the purpose. And they have to be manned.
The drop box has to be manned.
The drop boxes have to be manned under penalty. So then, If for some reason the drop box is not manned, the supervisor of election is fined $25,000.
Well, where do they pay that money from? The taxes? Or they have to go to their own?
It's their own. It becomes something that is charged to them personally.
Wow.
So,
and how much do supervisor of elections make?
Well, there's a formula. There's a formula across the state, and so I think the Orange County supervisor of election makes in the ballpark of between $160,000 and $170,000 for that position.
Gotcha.
So,
and then they have to pay that 25 G's out of their money,
out of their
pocket.
Then there is this question of what can you do with someone who is in line? Mm-hmm. So can you give them water? Yeah. Can you give them a slice of pizza if they're out there for 4 hours or 6 hours or whatever? And so basically the new law says that you can't do those things because, and the rationale is that it could potentially be considered as a gift, mm-hmm. and therefore cause the person to change their mind on who they're going to vote for. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say that in Miami-Dade County, that is kind of a rule that exists, that there is amount of space that you can't approach the voters mm-hmm. If they're in line, right? But I highly doubt that if I've made up my mind as to who I'm going to vote for, mm-hmm. that if somebody in a T-shirt for somebody comes and gives me a bottle of water, mm-hmm. that all of a sudden I'm going to change my mind about who I'm going to vote for. I'm sure that I've done my research mm-hmm. and decided beforehand who I'm going to vote for.
Right.
So many people believe that the combination of all of these things begins to create a challenge for some who already have difficulty, mm-hmm. one, getting to the polls, and keeping up with all the information mm-hmm. in order to vote. There is also this question about who's going to pay for the stamps and all of that. So in some counties the stamp is paid for, right. and some it's not, and so having to re-engage with your vote by mail every 2 years could, for some, mm-hmm. be a financial burden.
Now, I'm listening to you describe the specifics regarding the Florida law, mm-hmm. and it sounds very similar to what I've heard in the issues regarding the Georgia law. And so it makes me think back when we talk about the beginning that typically it's a group of people who get together and say, listen, I have this issue. Then they engage, a lobbyist to try to present this. Is that what happened in this situation with this voting rights law here in Florida?
Yeah, I think that with this law, you had people who looked at the last election mm-hmm. and said, what are some things that we can do to, quote unquote, strengthen the elections across this country? Mm-hmm. And they looked at what worked to keep people from the polls in the past, mm-hmm. and they modified that to today, and that's what we have in this package.
I see. So you believe this is a concerted effort to try to suppress the vote?
Absolutely.
You disagree with those that say this is just voting integrity?
Absolutely.
I see.
Absolutely.
Another law that was passed that may have an impact on us is protesting. We've seen many protests regarding George Floyd, and some of those protests did cause damage to the business and the community. So is this law, I believe, is there to protect the business from the property damage, or do you think it does more than that?
Yeah, so this law is an interesting one, mm-hmm. right? In that it creates new offenses. Mm-hmm. In that, I put it like this, and I'll just go ahead and say it. Like, we have stand your ground.
Yes, we
right?
do.
And stand your ground basically says you get to protect yourself.
Right.
Here, it's almost like extending that in the protest.
Even more so.
Right. So that if I see a protest mm-hmm. and I have credible fear, I can literally plow my car into folk because I am scared. And so now it's up to those who have been affected to prove that I was that they were in the right to be protesting.
So the interesting thing about Stand Your Ground, and I remember when Stand Your Ground first came out when I was a prosecutor, was that typically, we had the right to protect our property. If I was in my home, you came into my home, boom, I'll shoot you.
Right.
And listen, I was in fear, obviously.
Right.
Then Stand Your Ground then moved that outside of the home, where if I was walking down the street, and I felt in fear, then I could shoot you and say, I was standing my ground. Now, what you're saying is that this stand your ground concept seems to have been placed into the area of, okay, well, if I'm around a protest or in the vicinity of a protest and I'm in fear of my life because of a protest, I may be able to shoot somebody.
To protect myself. I didn't say shoot. I can protect myself.
Protect yourself.
From the quote-unquote mob.
I see.
From the quote-unquote mob.
I see. So there's immunity for me to protect me from the mob.
Right. You have other components as well. For instance, you have the component of police budgets, right? You will remember that at a certain time during the last summer, there was a lot of conversation about the concept of defunding the police.
Yeah.
Right. And I always thought that was a misnomer. And I'll just make it clear. I personally oppose the concept of defunding the police. I think you could redirect how the funds are being used. And there are cities that are examples of how that's being done, where you have task force that go out with the police, and you have law enforcement coupled with mental health providers to help bring down situations or help individuals who are having a mental health crisis, so that you don't have certain types of reactions there. But here you have, in essence, cities can be penalized for adjusting the budget for law enforcement. And so talk about preemption, right? So the state is basically saying, look, we don't trust you enough as local elected officials to do the right thing about law enforcement. So therefore, if you decrease the amount of funds that law enforcement has, then you have your state attorney that can come in and say, hey, I have a problem with this, and then they can take it up and have an issue they can take it up with the attorney general and so forth, so that.
But suppose the state attorney does not have an issue,
right? So then you wouldn't have an issue.
Okay.
Then you wouldn't have an issue. But that sets up in those counties, right, where you have a state attorney who may be of one party,
yes,
and you have a city council or a county commission,
maybe of another party,
right, and then that sets up that conflict.
Wow. So do you think, was there a problem with this? It sounds as though this is a proactive pushback against those who want to defund the police, in terms of making sure that whatever local police agency is not defunded. Is that an accurate assessment?
Say that again.
There seems to be a proactive pushback against those who want to defund the police, in making it a way that the police cannot be defunded in any way. Make it essentially a law that says, state attorney, if you believe that the police is not being funded accurately, you can then file a case against them.
Correct.
For doing that.
Correct.
And is that criminal liability now that we're talking with, or what kind of liability?
There are civil liabilities to that.
Okay.
And so you have real issues there. In essence, you're giving the state attorney veto power.
Right.
Over certain components of a county or city budget. Because
the local budget of that police is made by the city if they're in a city, or made by the county if it's a county perspective. So, for example, deputies are run by the counties. Local police, are run by the city commission, who determines how much money they get. And now the state attorney is now responsible, based upon this law, well, not responsible, but they can, if they want to, bring action against these entities if they believe that the police are not being funded adequately.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is one of the bills that is interesting on its face, because now some would argue on the other side of it that, hey, if you had a law like this in place on the 6th of January and that happened in Florida, then all of those people would have been in prison like right away.
Why do you say that?
Because it allows for rioters to be arrested just because they're out there rioting.
So what happened? Based upon what happened on January 6th in D.C., let's say that happened here in Florida, that this law would then give teeth to harsher punishment or prosecution of those individuals who riot.
Correct.
Interesting.
So often in legislation you have components that you might agree with, and then there are, but a lot of these things are in the eye of the beholder, right? Because you may see a Black Lives Matter gathering, which may not have a permit, and all of a sudden you call it a riot.
Right.
And if you call it a riot and you're a law enforcement officer, based on this law, you can arrest those people.
Gotcha.
So there are concerns. Now, like most pieces of legislation that make it through the process, you have year 1 and then year 2 happens and you have a glitch bill that comes in and you begin to fix the initial legislation, and over time you fix things that you identify that could be problematic with it.
Interesting. Do we know what is the statute number for the protesting bill?
Yeah, it's HB1.
That's the House bill number. And
House
the
bill number 1.
Okay.
And then in the Senate is 484.
Gotcha. Now, a bill that I thought was very interesting, in fact, it's a new law that was going to be implemented, I believe it's July 1st, is the law regarding college athletes, how they can now monetize their names or their likeness. Talk to us about that particular bill.
Yeah, so this has been an issue that has been percolating for years, that students have felt that institutions are making a lot of money on their likeness. And so therefore they have fought the fight to see if they can get compensated for their likeness, right? Because, there is a finite time when an athlete can make money on their prowess and performance. So this bill essentially creates that opportunity for that to happen in Florida. And so what it does, it will work with the NCAA, and then there's going to be rulemaking so that all of so they can set the standards and so forth to go along with that.
And I think there's motivation even for the colleges here in Florida in their recruitment, for UCF, University of Miami, for University of Florida, for USF, or FSU, and I'm not leave them, and our HBCUs, FAMU, and BCC. For all those college athletes, it's more of a reason come to Florida to be an athlete, because you can have the opportunity to make money off of your likeness based upon this particular bill.
So what's interesting about this bill was this is a perfect example of public outcry, right? So the bill was essentially dead, or certain provisions of it were going to be dead. And, the quarterback at FSU was like, hey, y'all need to fix this.
Right.
And then the board of governors of the university system said, hey, y'all need to fix this. We are in full negotiations with the NCAA, and our recruitment processes include the notion that we're going to be able to do X, Y, and Z here in Florida. So that's going to impact our recruitment classes across the state. And so on the last day or the day before the last day in session, there was an amendment that was put in to address the issues that they specifically wanted to address, and it's so the power of the voice of one is important.
The power of the people, right?
Yeah,
power to the people. There's another bill out there, a police training bill. Are you familiar with that?
I am.
What does that entail? What does this bill entail?
Well, this bill is a good example of bipartisan ship, right? Mm-hmm. Where people came together to say, hey, look, we need to make sure that police have bias training. Mm-hmm. They learn how to de-escalate circumstances and so forth. It reinforces the appropriate use of dash cams and body cams and all of those things. So here you have the speaker, and you have the Representative Driscoll from the Tampa area, mm-hmm. who is an attorney, and so she worked directly with the speaker to make sure that the provisions that she felt were important to protect the interests of people throughout our state were included in that. So it includes all those things like the bias training, mm-hmm. and all those type of things within the bill.
And this, again, you said this was a bipartisan bill.
Yeah.
All right. Another bill that's been catching a lot of news and media is the transgender ban. What is this bill in referencing to?
Yeah, so the transgender ban is a bill that addresses specifically male, female, trans. So people transition from males to females.
Okay.
And so this bill seeks to keep those people from competing in sports, non-co-ed sports, mm-hmm. With females. Mm. Right? So those who support the bill say that it gives the trans women mm-hmm. a competitive advantage mm-hmm. over the biological women.
Wow.
So that is a bill that raised a lot of interest. So there were a lot of amendments that were filed on that bill with ideas trying to see if, look, can they just identify the hormone levels to mm-hmm. see if they're on par, mm-hmm. But the bill sponsor found that that would be too complicated, right, to go through all that process. There was at a certain time, and so the bill did get better. There was at a certain time that there was going to be an inspection.
Wow.
Of body parts,
man,
to determine if someone was eligible to play and all of that. So this is one of those things that made it through the process this year.
So it deals specifically with men transitioning into women. It does not address women transitioning into men and competing in a male sport.
Right, because the notion is the impetus behind the bill is that there would be a competitive advantage,
and they believe that women transitioning to men don't have that same
competitive advantage.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, this would not be a discussion on law matters with an elder law attorney if we did not discuss some elder law bills that may be percolating out there. Many have seen the movie To Care a Lot, and I guess it I haven't seen it yet, but everyone's telling me to watch it. Addresses a guardian who was essentially exploiting the elderly. And one of the things that's really gets to me, being an elder law attorney, and even having parents and loved ones who are that age, is we don't want to see our elderly exploited. We need to be taking care of our elderly citizens. And there was a bill in an article that I was reading that tries to address this. Are you familiar with that particular bill that's percolating in the legislature now?
Yeah, I think I am. So that's House Bill 1041 and then Senate Bill 1344.
Right.
And the title of the bill is Protection of Elderly Persons and Disabled Adults. So what the bill essentially does, it creates or adds teeth to those who are exploiting seniors and disabled adults by one, inappropriately using their funds, by neglecting them or abusing them or so forth. So it adds It adds a real opportunity for prosecution under those instances.
Now, in reviewing that bill, was there anything in there in reference to what may happen to an inheritance or a trust that they may be beneficiaries of in reference to that bill? Do you recall if that bill tried to, as punishment, take away those things, or did not address those issues?
Yeah, so the bill is interesting in that it creates an opportunity it provides for persons of disabled adults that they may still retain inheritance, survivor rights, or other rights, or trust interest if victim executes specified instrument. So it allows a person that has the inheritance to sort of maintain the inheritance, but it sort of helps segregate them from execution powers over that.
I see. And what was those bill numbers again?
Sure. So the bill number for that one is 1041 in the House, and in the
Bill
Senate
1041,
and Senate Bill 1344.
So here's my instruction for those of you who have gone out to see the movie To Care a Lot and you're concerned about the elderly, or even if you haven't seen it and you're still concerned about it, pay attention to those particular bills, HB 1041 and SB 13. What was that number again?
1344.
1344. To see how that is moving along in the legislative session. If I wanted to see what was happening with bills that are pending, where is it that I can go to voice my opinion or to see what these bills are about?
Sure. So you could always go to the House, the myfloridahouse.gov or floridasenate.gov, and you could view if it's on live. You could put in a subject matter, and you can see all the bills that are of interest to you in that subject matter. You can identify who your legislators are by putting your zip code and so forth, and then you can engage with your legislators on that. So those are some ways that you can interact with people through the process. Now, you could always send in stuff to the committee to show your support or your opposition to something. But I think the most effective way to engage with your legislator is when they are not in session. Call their office and say that you want to meet.
And remember, as far as Florida is concerned, they're only in session 60 days
right.
out of the year. So we have all the rest of the time to contact them and to engage them in a peaceful and cordial manner, of course. And suppose I don't know who my legislature is in this day of technology. Where can I go to just maybe put my address in and zip code in to find out the phone number of my local House legislature or Senate legislature and email them or give them a call?
A couple different places. You can go to your supervisors of election. I mean, if you have a voter's registration card, it'll be on there, but you can go on there and put in your information, and it'll sort of tell you who represents you, and generally you'll have the phone number and contact information there. Or you can go to the Florida House website, myfloridahouse.gov or floridasenate.gov, and you put in your zip code. There's a thing of who's your representative, right. And you put in your zip code, and it'll put their information there, and then you can begin to contact them that way.
Thank you again, Brise, for being a part of this podcast. With a podcast titled Law Matters, it's just only, appropriate that we have a discussion on how our laws come into place and how they matter specifically to us. And I thank you so much for being on our podcast. Again, I want to invite our listening audience to like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also to our Apple Podcasts, our Spotify podcast, and all other areas where you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful time.